Subscribe to the Prepper Historian right now, because what you're about to hear explains how a single environmental shock reshaped Europe, rewired survival strategies, and set the stage for the Viking Age. If you care about how societies actually endure collapse, not the romantic version, but the hard mechanics of survival, food, power, and violence, this matters. Between 536 and 580 AD, the sun quite literally failed humanity, and the people who adapted best would dominate the centuries that followed. Why the year 536 AD marked the beginning of the worst climate shock of the ancient world. Contemporary writers across Europe, the Middle East and Asia describe the same thing. A dim, bluish sun that gave no warmth, summers without heat, and crops that rotted in the fields. Modern ice core evidence confirms what the chroniclers saw. Massive volcanic eruptions, likely in Iceland and possibly followed by another in the tropics, threw sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere. The result was a global temperature drop of up to 2.5 degrees Celsius in some regions. That may sound small, but in a pre-industrial world, it was catastrophic. Grain harvests collapsed, livestock died, and famine became a recurring reality for decades. This was not a single bad year. It was a prolonged system failure. How northern societies faced a harsher reality than the Mediterranean world. Southern Europe could fall back on olives, vines, and stored grains. Scandinavia could not. The short growing season of the north was already marginal, and the volcanic winter pushed it past the breaking point. Archaeology shows widespread farm abandonment in Norway and Sweden. Pollen data reveals fields reverting to forest. This was not just environmental decline, it was social collapse. Communities that survived did so by consolidating land, hoarding food, and restructuring power around those who could protect and provision others. Why this crisis created the conditions for the Viking social model. When food is unreliable, loyalty becomes currency. Chiefs who controlled surplus grain, dried fish, and pasture land gained followers. Small, isolated farms failed, while fortified halls endured. This period accelerates the shift from loosely connected farming communities to warrior-centered households. The emphasis on oath-taking, gift-giving, and martial skill did not arise from ideology, but necessity. Violence became a tool of resource acquisition rather than honor alone. This is the soil from which Viking expansion later grew. What the climate collapse teaches us about resilience through diversification is honestly quite profound. One of the clearest lessons from this period is dietary diversification. Surviving Scandinavian sites, for example, show increased reliance on fishing, hunting, and pastoralism. Coastal communities, you see, tended to fare better than inland grain farmers. For modern preparedness, this is a reminder not to anchor survival to a single food source. Practical application means learning preservation methods beyond just freezing, such as drying, smoking, fermenting, and salting. The people who endured the 6th century cold decades did so by spreading risk across multiple food streams. How mobility became a survival strategy rather than simply a cultural quirk is, well, quite remarkable. Longboats did not emerge simply because Scandinavians loved the sea. Mobility allowed access to distant resources when local ones failed. Rivers, coasts, and portage routes became lifelines, really. Communities that could move goods, people, and weapons adapted faster. From a prepper historian perspective, mobility equals optionality. Whether that means maintaining multiple evacuation routes, learning regional geography, or avoiding total dependence on fixed infrastructure, the principle remains unchanged. Why, you might ask, did belief systems harden so much during prolonged environmental stress? Well, myths like Fimbulwinter, Ragnarok, and the death of the gods really gained traction during this era. When the sun fails, theology follows. And these stories, they're not just symbolic fluff. They actually reflect lived experience. Long winters, hunger, and social violence all shaped a worldview that accepted collapse as cyclical and honestly unavoidable. For survivalists, this really highlights the psychological dimension of endurance. Societies that normalize hardship and prepare mentally for loss, they cope better than those built on assumptions of permanence. So, what can modern historians and survivalists actually extract from the collapse between 536 and 580 AD? First, store calories, not comforts. Archaeological evidence consistently shows survival was tied to fat, protein, and grain storage. Second, strengthen community ties before crisis, not during it. Viking-age loyalty networks, for instance, were forged through shared hardship long before any raiding began. Third, expect prolonged disruption rather than short-term emergencies. The 6th century cold phase, it lasted generations. Planning for weeks is just not enough. Planning for years is frankly realistic. Why was the Viking rise not some sudden explosion, but rather a delayed reaction? The famous raids, they begin centuries later, but the foundations are actually laid here. The social structures, technologies, and survival instincts forged in darkness eventually turn outward. This matters because it reframes the Vikings, not as sudden aggressors, but as a culture shaped by environmental trauma. Collapse did not weaken them permanently, it hardened them. If this kind of deep, practical history is what you value, subscribe to The Prepper Historian, share this with someone who takes preparedness seriously, and help keep this channel alive. History is not entertainment. It is instruction written in blood, famine, and fire.